Today I want to begin a discussion about climate change in the South Pacific to provide some information about this problem in the region and to carry through this discussion about how we might begin to think about vulnerability. Let's talk about exposure. Remember, we said that vulnerability was about exposure, sensitivity and adaptive capacity. It's commonly understood in the Pacific Islands that they're all equally vulnerable, and that's very much because people imagine that they're all little islands in the middle of the ocean. In fact, there are at least 5 different kinds of islands in the South Pacific, and not all of them are very low lying. There are some very high continental islands such as Papua New Guinea. There are lots of volcanic islands in the Pacific, and there are of course some low-lying atolls like the Marshall Islands. So, because the nature of these islands differs quite markedly and people live all over them in high places and low places and inland and on the coast and so on, they're not all equally exposed to climate change. It's also the case that the way climate systems across the South Pacific work means that the regional climate patterns also don't affect places equally. So El Nino, for example, tends to bring drought over to the Western Pacific, but nowhere near as much drought in the Central Pacific, for example. Some science, and this is from the 4th Assessment Report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, says that it's going to get warmer in the region, but this depends a bit on the nature of the island. It depends a bit on elevation as well, but it's going to get warmer to some degree, and it's been suggested that heat waves will become more frequent. Very considerable degree of uncertainty about precipitation, and again we're talking regionally, so these are regional climate models covering islands of lots of different kinds, but a variation of on annual precipitation of somewhere plus or minus 15%, so that doesn't help very much with planning, but it is suggested that when it rains, it will rain less often and more intensely, so that would suggest that problems of flooding, places that get flooding may have greater problems of flooding, and it also suggests that there may be more drought. There's some evidence in the science that suggests storms will become more intense, but I'm not quite sure about whether they'll become more frequent. There's estimates of sea level rise that suggest it will rise by between 9 and 88 centimetres. That also coral bleaching, and now in particular because of the problem of ocean acidification, will cause greater stress on coral reefs. And El Nino in the ENSO cycle, which has a very significant event on particularly precipitation, but to some degree cyclones, may change, but again there's uncertainty about that. So this is what the science is telling us. There are efforts to try and downscale these regional climate predictions to particular islands. But if you think about planning for these problems, 9 to 88 centimetres by 2100 is not a particularly helpful piece of information. So what they're saying is sea levels may rise by a little bit, or they might rise by a lot, and we don't know when. The issue about coral bleaching depends a lot on all sorts of factors that we're not certain about. So 2 points to make here. One is that exposure varies quite widely across the region, in fact, according to climate pattern, according to the nature of the islands, and according to, from a social vulnerability point of view, where people live on those islands across the region. But also, from the purposes of just saying, well, we can plan for these impacts, actually the science isn't very clear, there's a lot of uncertainty, and it means that it's not possible to pick certain solutions in response to these problems, because actually it's still quite uncertain about the magnitude of the problem and the timing of these problems. When are they going to happen is as important as knowing where they're going to happen. There are all sorts of reasons why sensitivity to climate change varies across the South Pacific, and there's all sorts of sensitivities depending on the nature of the risk, whether we're talking about rainfall, or whether we're talking about heat events, or whether we're talking about extreme events, cyclones, or whether we're talking about sea level rise. So it's a very big conversation. But to give you some examples of why sensitivity also varies across the region and what some of the main forms of sensitivity are. Most people in the Pacific, most of the food they get is grown locally or is caught from the reefs and from the oceans. very little, almost none of the food that is produced in the Pacific Islands is irrigated. So there's no dams, there's no pipes, there's no sprinklers and irrigation systems. So they all rely on rainfall to get water to feed plants. Now, droughts do have a significant impact on food production in the Pacific Islands. In 1997, there was a significant drought related to an El Nino event that caused widespread hunger in the highlands of Papua New Guinea and parts of Melanesia. Many crops, and this depends on the soils, are quite sensitive to periods of no rainfall. A widely eaten tuber across the Pacific is taro, called dalo or talo, depending on where you are in the region. And after about a month of no rainfall, depending on the soil, the talo crop starts to die. Now, the loss of a talo crop in many parts of the Pacific, particularly Polynesia, is a significant problem for nutrition, particularly for carbohydrates. If we think about coasts and sea level rise and storm events, then sensitivity varies quite widely too, and there's some very interesting science around this issue. The response of coasts, of course, depends a bit on the nature of those coasts. If they're rocky, volcanic substances that make up the coast, as for example in Samoa, they erode far less than if they're soft sandy beaches comprised of sediment from the land or from microorganisms living on the reef. So it depends on what the coast is, depends on how they deal with extreme events and sea level rise. How the coast is used and the kinds of impacts from humans on the coast also has a big impact. Coasts are quite dynamic processes. Sediment moves around over time, according to seasons, from year to year, according to the direction of prevailing winds and waves and so on. And when development occurs and wharves and airports and seawalls are built, it disrupts the movement of sediment. In some places, sand is mined. Just visited a nice new property development in Fiji where I was told that the sand, which was lovely and white, was mined from an outer island, and I thought, well, that's great. I wonder who lives on that island. These things increase the sensitivity of coasts to sea level rise, of reefs to coral bleaching as well. And so there's some evidence that shows that islands that don't have a heavy impact of development are more able to deal with coral bleaching events, and sea level rise and extreme events don't have such an impact upon the coastal systems on those islands. So the human impact on the coast is a very significant factor in sensitivity to sea level rise as well. And finally, we begin to think about the way people live their lives and the extent to which livelihoods are sensitive to climate change. And this depends on many factors. But people who get most of their food and make their living from farming or from fishing, and indeed people who work in tourism, tend to be, their incomes and their health and their nutrition tends to be more sensitive to climate change than people who work for the government in a capital city, for example. Tourism is sensitive too. When extreme events strike major tourism markets like Fiji, for example, visitors cancel their bookings and hotel resorts tend to lay off their casual workers, and so they don't get paid. Some really significant and important dependencies on natural resources in the Pacific. In atolls like Tuvalu, people are eating up to 100 kilograms of fish per person per year. That's a lot of fish. It's an awful lot of protein, and it costs very little to acquire. Now, in islands like this, if the availability of fish was significantly reduced, that would have a very significant impact on people's food consumption and on their health, and also on their incomes, because they would have to spend what little money they have to try and find substitutes for fish. Here are some examples: fishing and vanilla production. When Cyclone Heta went through Niue in 2006, there was a big crop of organic vanilla that they were hoping to export and make money from, and the vanilla production was completely destroyed. And all those people who had invested their hard work and their money in vanilla lost that investment because of the cyclone. Adaptive capacity varies quite widely across the region too, and I'm going to give you some statistics here about countries, and these are from the Secretariat of the Pacific Community. So urbanisation varies quite widely. This matters a little bit for adaptive capacity because it's easier to provide services, healthcare, education, water and energy to people living in cities than it is to people living remotely in rural areas. So in a place like Papua New Guinea, it's very difficult to provide basic services, the opportunities that help people adapt, because they're living widely distributed across areas that are quite difficult to reach, whereas in Nauru, quite highly urbanised. Money is also quite widely variable. There are parts of the Pacific that are quite wealthy, the Cook Islands, for example, and Palau, where incomes per workers are quite high, and there are parts where incomes are very low, and that's the income per worker in Papua New Guinea, let alone the people who don't work. There's poverty, and so countries tend to define their own poverty lines, what they consider to be a level below which people would be poor relative to the cost of living in those countries. And poverty is quite low in a country like Niue, where people are generally all above the poverty line, or most of them are, to quite high in a country like the Marshall Islands, where half the population lives below their own defined poverty line. So these are people then who struggle to procure food, struggle to send their children to school, have difficulty accessing healthcare, who may pay quite a lot for energy and clean water, whose livelihoods are quite sensitive and whose capacity to deal with that is quite limited in the event that climate changes. Maternal mortality is a very good indicator of social vulnerability. A society where there's good healthcare, where women are well nourished, where women breastfeed, and where there's a reasonable amount of income tends to have very low maternal mortality. Societies that have very high maternal mortality are typically those that have very low incomes, but also where women tend to be significantly disadvantaged within social systems. And so you can see a wide range of maternal mortality, quite safe to give birth in a country like Palau, but quite dangerous to give birth in a country like Papua New Guinea. So in a climate situation here where there may be a drought, less production of food, where soils may be drier, or where it may be hotter, then these problems of maternal mortality that are quite significant in Papua New Guinea can be even increased by climate change under some circumstances. We can begin to think about how governments are investing in, on the amount of money they have to invest in some of the basic opportunities that help people adapt to climate change. Health, for example. Spending on health varies quite widely across the region. It's very low in a country like Papua New Guinea. It's not bad in a country like Palau. So we might expect that the health risks that climate change brings are going to have a greater impact in Papua New Guinea because they're less able to invest in dealing with those problems than they would in Palau. Education is very important. It helps to have an educated workforce. It helps to have people who are literate in order to respond to changes and respond to climate change. And again, we see quite different levels of education attainment in the Pacific Islands. Quite low in Papua New Guinea, a little bit over 40% of students don't finish primary school, whereas all of them do in a country like Niue. And electricity is important too. If you want your kids to do their homework at night, it helps to have a light by which they can read. If you want to be able to receive messages about forthcoming droughts or disasters or government education programs about sanitation and water, for example, it helps to have electricity. Large areas of the Pacific have no electricity. A country like the Solomon Islands, only 12% of households have it. In a country like Tuvalu, every household has it. So these are the kinds of opportunities that we begin to look at to build up a profile of the capacity that different groups in different countries have to adapt to climate change. And it varies quite widely. So, two conclusions here. We say that in general the islands of the Pacific are vulnerable to climate change because in general they're quite exposed. In general, people living there are quite sensitive, and in general adaptive capacity is quite low. But this isn't true for all places. Exposure varies quite widely across the region. Sensitivity varies quite widely across the region, and adaptive capacity varies quite widely across the region. And so this is to say simply, not everyone in the Pacific and not every island in the South Pacific is very vulnerable to climate change. But it is also to say, when we're thinking about trying to respond to climate change and think about adaptation solutions, how countries can deal with these risks of climate change, it helps to have a better understanding of their exposure, their particular sensitivities and their particular adaptive capacities, and work with those to devise solutions. One solution to climate risks isn't going to work everywhere in the region.